It's day 195. It's also November 17th, 2019. And we're in Bagdad, Arizona. You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. We continued that trek on Date Creek Road, leaving our spot near the railroad tracks in Congress, and watching the mountains built with boulders give way to a vast open space, lined with mountains, and dotted sporadically with the large green patches of agricultural activity. But still, every once in a while, one of those stately saguaro cacti. Now, having seen and learned of these guys for the first time as we transitioned from the Mohave Desert into the Sonoran Desert, I started to do some reading on this interesting plant, known only to exist naturally in this part of the world. The first thing I'd learn is that I'd apparently been pronouncing it wrong. But after watching a couple of videos about it, it appears the proper pronunciation is saguaro as opposed to saguaro. Saguaro is a Mexican Spanish word that doesn't appear to mean anything except its use to refer to this pretty cool type of cactus. The next thing I figured out is that you can go down a rabbit hole on this one pretty quickly, mainly because information seems to be all over the board when it comes to how long they've been around, and in particular, growth rates. And I didn't really want to spend a couple of hours becoming a botanist, so I stuck with some quick but pretty interesting takeaways. First, these guys. If you're looking at a 20-foot, 40-foot, or even 60-foot tall saguaro, this guy's been around a while. They grow super slowly. And by design, nature's design. A ton of time is invested in this seedling, building the foundation that will ultimately lead to the century or so old plant that I could be looking at right now. During the first 10 years of a saguaro seedling's life, it'll reach a mind-boggling height of not more than a couple inches. That first 10 years is spent near, even under, what is called a nurse plant. Saguaro seedlings can only sprout when protected by another plant, one that'll provide shelter, shade, and the critical moisture needed during the plant's formative years. It turns out, this particular plant is likely the epitome of a species that has spent some 4,000 to 8,000 years carefully adapting to the harsh environment that it'll be born into. And that foundation being built is, first, the root system. The plant simultaneously develops a taproot that will eventually reach some 5 or 6 feet in depth, along with a lateral root system that grows along with the cactus. The lateral root system is just 3 inches below the surface of the desert and typically spans laterally around the plant, equal to the height of the plant. A 60-foot tall saguaro, for example, can have a lateral root system that spans some 70 feet around it in every direction. And the genius of nature at work here? During a single rainstorm, that root system surrounding a single mature saguaro can absorb up to 200 gallons of water into the plant, storing it for the next desert drought. The second part of that foundation is the plant's structure itself. The thick, malleable skin covered with that waxy film, all built and strengthened over time, layer upon layer, to support the plant's growth and weight, not to mention retain water. All this results in a plant that takes some 35 years or more to reach maturity and flower for the first time, but can go on to live nearly 2 centuries before lapsing back into the desert dirt from which it was born. There was more, a lot more, and I have no idea why I was so fascinated by this. Maybe I do want to be a botanist. Probably not. But as I've learned so many times here, that it's while reading about one thing, you can learn some pretty cool stuff about other things too. Like during this read, I started to become curious to know what, if a 2-century-old saguaro cactus was not among the longest living species in the world, what is? And wouldn't you know it, one of the oldest, the creosote bush, which can be found right here in this same Arizona desert, can live for thousands of years, and likely have served as a nurse plant for generations of saguaros. And then there's the bristlecone pine. These trees, found only in the western United States, are among the oldest living organisms on Earth. And they grow slowly too. You know, that whole build a foundation thing that Mother Nature seems to have all figured out. And some of these individual trees can be over 5,000 years old. And again, they can only be found naturally in California, Nevada, and Utah. I might have even driven past some of these in the last few months. I'm going to need to pay closer attention the next time I find myself in the proximity of a tree that could be over 5,000 years old. But for now, let's get back to this dirt road we're on. The road that would take us by other things, like that metal contraption on the side of the road. It was built on what at one point was a solid wooden structure, clearly a valued and carefully crafted piece of mining equipment over a century ago. But how did it come to find its final resting place in this patch of the Arizona desert? My guess is that the last set of human hands that ever operated it are long since gone, and only the failing wooden structure and the remaining rusted-out pieces of metal, that's all that's left to tell the rest of the story. And they're not telling. But they do their part in conjuring up the curiosity and imagination of a guy like me. That same curiosity and imagination would be conjured time and time again as we stop to take photos of other desert oddities. Take that ranch entrance arch, for example. Still standing proudly, clearly at one point in time, another human took the time to build the structure marking the entrance to their brand new life, and likely the name of the ranch once hung proudly from it. And it was built well. Obviously, it's still here. But today, it marks only the remnant of a driveway that once was. And now everything covered in sagebrush and weathered by time. And what about those big old trucks we passed by? I mean, really big, Army-style vehicles, I think. World War II era, maybe? They didn't start their service here in the desert some 70 or 80 years ago. What have they seen? Where have they been? And how did they end up here? And why? Is this their final resting place? Only to become a rusted-out piece of metal just like that piece of mining equipment a mile or so back up the road? Around nearly every corner, the same curiosity, just a different object. In some cases, it'd be a ranch house. One still providing shelter from this desert for someone. But just across this dirt road, another, abandoned long ago to be reclaimed by this desert. But this one, brandishing a for sale sign promising someone their chance at life on a few acres of this desert. Will anyone find the $20,000 asking price worth it? Probably. Someday. At one point, we even drove by an orchard, though it looked like it had seen better days. But maybe that's just what an orchard looks like when it's in the middle of a desert. And the huge ranches, Some still vibrant with activity, others dormant, marked with those faded for sale signs hanging crooked and swinging in the wind. And then, our Date Creek Road led us past what looked like lava rock-riddled fields, and we came across a band of wild horses. And they seemed unaffected by our passing, or the fact that they were grazing alongside cattle. And just up the road from that a bit, we'd come upon another one of those for sale signs. This one at the gated entrance of someone's old home and someone else's new home to be. So we pulled in. We pulled round that big circular driveway in the desert dirt, taking note of the abandoned rock-walled pond in the center of the old driveway. That pond had clearly been the object of the previous dwellers' children. Brightly and colorfully painted, all in fun. We pulled up in front of that little adobe-style dwelling, clearly vacant, and thought, good a place as any for lunch and some exploring. Maybe even a little reading. Oh yeah, that's where you would have found us, eating a grilled cheese sandwich while reading about that saguaro cactus. But we'd also spend a couple of hours nosing around the house, that backyard concrete patio, strategically placed under a massive ironwood tree, providing just the perfect shade for the hot desert afternoon. Then, exploring the perimeters of this little ranch in the desert, studying how someone had once carefully fenced off a few acres, built that little adobe-style home, along with a few outbuildings, and then, it appears, had spent years tending to what they had built, and then moved on. After lunch, we'd pull back out onto that washboard dirt road and find asphalt once again just a few miles up in a place called Hillside, Arizona. And shortly after that, our road, that road that had taken us some 45 miles through a desert that only a few call home, would end. And we had two choices. Prescott was about 60 miles to our right, but 23 miles to the left, we were being invited to visit a place called Bagdad. So left it was. And just a few miles later, pulling into Bagdad on a Sunday afternoon was oddly quiet for a town of over 2,000. Even the gas station where we stopped to fuel up was unmanned. The handwritten sign on a piece of cardboard taped to the shop door read, 24-hour fueling convenience, credit and debit cards only. In fact, the only signs of life were just up the street at a little grocery store. I drove back up Main Street contemplating whether to stay or go, when I saw a sign, Rodeo Grounds, with an arrow pointing to the left. And it was no surprise that as we crested a hill about a mile outside of town, that road was once again dirt. At the bottom of that hill, we found an archery range with a large flat parking area. And 15 minutes later, we were parked, and Dougie and I were out exploring. Just past the archery range, we crossed a cattle guard and entered the Bagdad Corrals. It looked to be some sort of boarding facility, maybe. The rundown pieced-together facility was a series of pens tacked together using rusty sheets of tin, shipping containers, and just about any other means of repurposed material you could imagine. And yet, this was the only other place in town that we had seen activity. Lots of activity, actually. A steady stream of pickups dusted up and down that dirt road hill, rattling across the cattle guard well into the night. And that flurry of activity picked up right where it had left off around 5 o'clock the following morning. But just behind those corrals, we found the home of the Copper Spur Rodeo Company. Interesting. It seems that these desert cowboys enjoy a rodeo from time to time, just like everyone else. And I guess when you live around 100 miles or so from, well, anywhere, you tend to find ways to bring the fun to you. And the smell of horses and hay filling up the air conjured up those visions of straw hats, cowboy boots, and wranglers, all on rodeo day, whenever that is. As we walked back towards Vacilando, I noticed that 2 pickup trucks had parked adjacent us. 2 bow cases sat on the ground between the 2 men taking turns at the archery field. I started to settle in a bit and start reading about this secluded place called Bagdad. But as I started to read, I couldn't help but overhear the conversations just outside the door, on that archery range. It was a lively debate around the upcoming bow season, best places to hunt, on which they very much disagreed, and the effects of wind speed on accuracy of shot over distance. And each had a story of that massive whitetail they'd been chasing for years. Their conversations and debates, occasionally interrupted by the silence, and then the thwop sound of an arrow hitting that target, tacked to a bale of hay. But finally, it was back to reading about Bagdad. The first thing I'd learn is that Bagdad is a company town, one of the very few remaining in the United States. In fact, a search shows only a handful of them across the country, and also interesting to read that most of the remaining company towns are all in Arizona, but more reading would make it pretty easy to see why. First, what is a company town? The concept was born during the Industrial Revolution era, and at its peak, there would be around 2,000 company towns across the country. These towns were built by the company to house workers and provide the necessary amenities, thus helping to ensure a strong and secure worker base while providing a quality of life for those workers and their families. Since the company built the town, it therefore owned the town, including the infrastructure and even most of the housing. Most often, these towns were built in remote locations in which large-scale industrial operations were taking place. And in most cases, the industry was mining, which explains why company towns were, and in some cases still are, a prominent fixture in Arizona, where some of the nation's largest mineral deposits have been discovered over time. Bagdad, in particular, was founded in 1882 when a couple of guys named W.J. Pace and J.M. Murphy discovered copper ore in the area. Initially, the mining operations were small-scale and underground, focusing on extracting not only copper, but gold, silver, and lead as well along the Copper Creek. In 1928, the first mill was constructed to process ore from the underground mine. But by 1929, large-scale mining had commenced with block caving. This is a technique used for underground mining of a low-grade ore. By the 1940s, the transition to open-pit mining had begun, and the Bagdad Copper Corporation was formed. But by 1944, a new owner and general manager would begin making significant investments into the operation, taking it to new heights in copper production. The mine has shifted ownership through the years, but its location on one of the nation's largest copper reserves maintains its rank as one of the top 5 producing copper mines in the country. The Bagdad mine produces nearly 10,000 metric tons of copper each year. And what in the heck does 10,000 metric tons mean? Well, it means around 22 million pounds. Ask the internet what on earth might weigh around 22 million pounds. It'll tell you the Eiffel Tower, a cruise ship, even a fully loaded freight train. So yeah, that's a lot of copper. And why is copper so valuable or necessary? It's copper's electrical and thermal conductivity, which means that anything in our world that requires electricity or is electronic related probably starts with copper. Yup. Pretty necessary, I think to myself as I tap away on this electronic device on my lap and the one next to me on the table, over 140 years after those 2 guys filed a copper claim in a place that would soon be called Baghdad. And the town's name? I gotta say, of all the stories I've read about how towns got their names, this one might be one of my favorites. Because for hearing the name Baghdad in my brain, I automatically went to that ancient city in the Middle East, in what is now Iraq. It's spelled a little differently, throwing in that H, but that nearly 1,300-year-old city has seen it all. Conquest and riches, spanning centuries of the Muslim faith and culture, but also experiencing devastation in times of war, which have been many in that part of the world, including an 8-year period not so long ago in which it would be us, the United States, bombing this ancient city. But through it all, this sacred Islamic place remains. And with over 8 million residents, it's second in population only to Cairo in the Arab world today. So in my mind, it wasn't much of a stretch to make the connection between a little mining town and the Arizona desert and the rich history of one of the oldest cities in a very different Arabian desert, some 7,500 miles away. However, turns out, local legend in this part of the Arizona desert tells a much different story. And as the legend goes, a father-son mining duo would arrive in the area in the late 1800s staking a claim and beginning a very small-scale copper mining operation. The father's job was to dig out the ore, while the son's job was to load it into bags to be carted out. And each time the son filled a bag, he'd shout out, "Baghdad." The phrase, "Baghdad," would catch on. So much so that in 1910, when the area's first post office was established, it would be called Baghdad. So who knows, really? Is the local legend the story folks around here like to tell? Or was the reality that there's some connection with that faraway place? Documentation for the time is scarce. So personally, I think I'll go with the story of that young miner working hard alongside Pops and yelling, "Baghdad," ever so often. Now, Baghdad is likely many things I'll never know, in addition to what I just learned. But as I drove out of town the next morning, leaving the same level of activity on a Monday morning as we'd driven into on a Sunday afternoon, I thought of what I did know. First, a quiet life at the end of a road. It truly is the town at the end of a road. If you are an individual inclined to travel only on paved roads, you have only one way in, and that same way out of Baghdad. More adventuresome? Well, they have an option or two more, but those options involve dirt roads and four-wheel drives. I also knew that as quiet as this town might feel, we were leaving behind one of the busiest and most productive copper mines in the country. The mine itself is a few miles outside of town beyond where we had camped on the parking lot of that archery field. We didn't make it all the way out to the mine this time. Maybe next trip. And as Main Street became Highway 96 and Baghdad waved goodbye through my rearview mirror, for some reason I thought about that movie, Baghdad Cafe. Well, it turns out the cafe in the film is actually 287 miles away in a place called Newberry Springs, California. Only portions of the film were actually shot here in Baghdad, but the film got this town's name. I think I was reminded of that movie because I couldn't help but visualize Yasmin's skirt-clad silhouette walking out of the wide-open desert that we were driving into. Suitcase in tow, and the feather in her hat fluttering in the wind. Her shape distorted a bit by the heat reflecting off the hot asphalt. And also, remembering when Yasmin, never having seen a desert, told Brenda, "After all, every life could use a little magic. I was reminding myself to watch that movie again when we came upon the roadside memorial, the one we'd driven past on the way into Baghdad. I'd made a mental note to stop on the way out, so we did. I was interested to learn more. We've all seen roadside memorials, in most cases, marking a tragic loss of life on or alongside a road. But this one was different from any I had seen before anyway. It was more than a sign, a marker, or some plastic flowers. This one was built. It was constructed, clearly, with not only the intent to memorialize a life that meant so much to someone, but also it looked as if it were built to invite others, maybe someone just like me, to stop and invest some time maybe into learning about that someone that meant so much to the person that had created where I was today. More than a shrine of sorts, there were pathways, seating areas, rocks painted with hearts and names. A small mausoleum-like structure. The front was open, but barred off, for its preservation of the contents, but at the same time, allowing me to see the photos and the pieces of jewelry carefully placed within it. A little digging around the internet would tell me that this roadside memorial thing in Arizona was often referred to as descanso, and that the tradition of placing roadside memorials in the Southwest dates back over 200 years. The term descanso means resting place in Spanish, and originally referred to the spots where funeral processions would rest while transporting the deceased to their final resting place. This practice evolved into marking the sites of tragic accidents with crosses or other markers. This practice would continue to evolve in Arizona, when during the 1940s and 50s, the Arizona State Highway Patrol began using white crosses to mark the sites of fatal car accidents. This practice contributed to the spread and visibility of roadside memorials, and over time, these markers have become more and more elaborate, incorporating various cultural and personal elements, all of which are super evident in the memorial I'm sitting in. Now, it was interesting to me that here, I didn't see any names in that mausoleum-type structure. I did see photos. The photos told the story of a family man, a young man, a man that wore our country's uniform and saw combat, and a man that was missed terribly. And while I may not know his name, after hanging out with his memory for a few minutes, I thanked him and his family for his service, and then found my way back down that dirt path to the highway. Arriving back at that intersection in Hillside a few minutes later, we would go in the opposite direction this time. The sign said Prescott, and we could see the mountains rising out of the desert on the horizon. And as the miles passed and those mountains drew near, I found myself once again whispering to myself, I wonder what we'll learn there. Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously, you can.